Hello, everybody. Happy morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you're at when you're watching this. Welcome to Making Sense of. Today, I'm talking to Monika Bielskyte from somewhere far off in Europe about some interesting stuff. So let me share my screen with you quickly because I want to tell the story of how this all came about. So way back in, let's say, 2017, this Twitter thread popped up that talked about alternative designs for Ghost in the Shell. And I found it spectacularly interesting because it was this completely different vision of what the future may look like in movies. And I was thinking, who is this person who has this warm, organic view of the world, and why isn't this how we see the world in science fiction? And shortly thereafter, an article was published called Virtual Reality as Possibility Space, and it has some of the same graphics in it. And in this article, Monika expressed a lot of the things that I think we all feel when we watch how technology evolves, around this idea that technology evolves based on what we envision technology to be. And if we always think of it as this negative space, then technology evolves in a negative direction. There's a quote in here that a lot of people have highlighted that says, technological innovation without humanitarian evolution equals a dystopian future. And this article was impactful enough to me that I made all my students in interaction design read it, and it became part of the curriculum because it forces us to think about design, not just as we are solving a problem today, but in the context of we are designing something that then designs the future for us. Now, Monika has published the Protopia Futures Framework, a new way of thinking about futurism, and that's what we are going to talk about today. So welcome to this chat, Monika.
Hi, thank you so much. God, Ghost in the Shell feels like so old and still way too cyberpunk for me. But yeah, that was a while back. Because, I mean, the time when I published, it was already like the designs were already 3 years old. So this, I think the original research, the work that I was doing, this was like 7 years ago or something like that. And obviously, I think a lot of things have changed since, and a lot of things have evolved. So since then, my vision of the world has become way more biological even than that.
That's, are you suggesting that things evolve over time and change?
Right. It's a positive, especially when you work on film projects. By the time it's out, you're like, "Ooh, I'm not even sure I want anybody to see it anymore."
It's very interesting to see how long it takes from someone shoots a movie or something till it actually comes live, and then if something significant changes in the world in between, it gets very odd. So Monika, you have to tell us, where are you right now? Because
I am in the country of my birth, Lithuania. I have not sort of full-time lived here for a very long time, and I have an interesting and sometimes tenuous relationship with it. But I've been trying to come back every summer and enjoy the wild berries and wild mushrooms and quiet time for reading, thinking, reflection.
Yeah, I ask because when I've been following you for many years now, and it feels like you're always in a new place. And it's very interesting to just be like, where is Monika now?
Yeah, I've been living this crazy nomadic life before it became like some kind of hipstery thing for almost a decade now, meaning I have not had like a fixed abode, and I've been moving around the world for research more than anything, for projects. And that's been a very, very interesting experience. So I think I'm hitting 100 countries soon. So that definitely changes you, because you understand that there's no one way to see things and everything. And everything that I do, it's about trying to combine multiplicity of perspectives, really. So, I guess my life and my work have very much become the same, for better or worse. But it definitely made me a much more open person than I could have ever been if I would have just stayed put.
Yeah, and I feel like that's sort of the core of this idea you have, this Protopia futures framework, this idea that there's a multiplicity to everything, and there's everything is not the same. So can you I just want you to talk about this, because I read the article and I'm sitting there going, this is where, well, first of all, this is where in like future design should go, but this is actually where just design should go in general, not just about the future, but about the present as well. So I want to give you the opportunity to really tell people about it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's really kind of you. Appreciate the words. I mean, language shapes how we see the world, and we've known that for a long time. It's not just words. It's never just words. I think right now there's a whole lot of conversations like, oh, why are you so bothered with words? But words set the foundation of how we see the world, and based on how we see the world and how we see ourselves in the world and of the world or outside of the world, that's how we also treat the world and everybody that exists in that world, be it other people or other species, or sort of the planet itself. And when it comes to the future, I think it's really important to think of, well, what kind of frameworks that we have to think about it. And the two most popular frameworks have been now for a while, dystopia and utopia, right? And they were perceived as these polar opposites. So very much, I mean, it's a very much sort of religious framework, heaven and hell, right? And so utopia is the so-called heaven where everything is perfect. And don't you dare to question if it is perfect, because then you're going to be punished. And then dystopia, well, everything is messed up. And so there's nothing you can do about it. And so, both of them really deeply remove the agency of a human being that is not part of the deciding elite, the ruling elite of dystopia or the decision elite of utopia. And I found that none of these was really satisfactory. The problem, with dystopia is that it's become so regurgitated that it's no more a cautionary tale. It's just something that further entrenches already harmful stereotypes. Like, we don't need to be told anymore. I mean, majority of the world's population doesn't need to be repeated that, misogyny is going to lead towards dystopia. We know that, right? And that kind of regurgitation of stereotypes in the context of future of all these magical technologies, from whatever intergalactic space travel to whatever else you're going to name, becomes deeply disempowering. If you say that, well, we're going to be able to develop all these incredible scientific theories, develop all these incredible technologies, but we will remain racist, misogynist, ableist, homophobic, xenophobic, like, what hope does that give you when it comes to humanity? And especially for anybody who comes from a marginalized background, what does that make you feel? It makes you are forever anchored in the oppressive relationship with the world. Like, there is literally no hope for you. If you're disempowered today, you will remain, and it will just get worse, right? So it's deeply, deeply harmful on one side. And on the other side, it almost becomes a product roadmap, right? So it becomes something that, like, well, this is a bad future, but we could still make this product that actually will facilitate this bad future. We'll be making a lot of money from it. So why don't we do it? Because anyway, everything is about quarterly returns. So, let's just cash in while we can, because end of the world is near. Right?
I just want to point out, like, I see this every time people talk about VR and AR, because the default reference to VR and AR is always Minority Report. because that was the movie that was basically just so solidly centered around the idea of VR and AR and Tom Cruise doing this all the time. And I talked to people who, like interaction designers who design VR and AR, and they always go to like, oh, we want to make this Minority Report style interface, right? And I'm like, you do understand that that movie is about like the worst possible future for technology and everything else. And even when people try to make that interface and they realize doing this, the thing that Tom Cruise is doing, is just physically exhausting and limiting and only available to extremely strong people. And he had to go through like a training regimen just to be able to hold his hands up for that long. So this entire notion that the industry is working around is a dystopian future in itself. And that's the target now.
Yeah. And I mean, it took such a long time, bizarrely, for people to realize that. It's problematic in many regards, but it also is great in a sense that it perfectly illustrates how dystopian future vision in the entertainment world becomes a techno-utopian answer in technology, but especially Silicon Valley technology context. Mm-hmm. Right? And so many visions of a future that within Silicon Valley context are being sold as, wow, this is a great idea. This is something that we should strive towards. You know, it comes from a dystopian scenario in the entertainment world, right? Mm-hmm. And so that kind of loops back into this idea, well, that they are really one and the same. You know, yeah. They are not they're not on the opposing sides of the spectrum. They're really just reverse sides of the same coin. You know, and bizarrely enough, within both of them, the same people hold power. And nobody questions that maybe that's where the problem lies. Because both within Utopia and dystopia, very similar people hold power and very similar people remain either dispossessed or entirely erased. You know, yeah. Funny enough, dystopia oftentimes allows for more people of marginalized backgrounds to survive. And Utopia, like so that's what we have to remember, right? When people say, well, Utopia is the answer. And even a lot of, authors and scholars that I respect so much still use Utopia as a framework. Mm-hmm. And I find that deeply, deeply problematic. And I think that's being done just because there's no better word. And I would like for Utopia to be a better word, obviously. But we have to understand that Utopia cannot be separate from eugenics movement. Mm-hmm. You know, the roots of Utopia is about eliminating whoever and whatever doesn't fit that very narrow, very homogenous framework. And so it has always been, almost without any exception, deeply, deeply ableist, genocidally ableist, and queerphobic. Mm-hmm. Which includes transphobic, homophobic, etc., and oftentimes also anti-indigenous, anti-indigenous, racist, xenophobic, anti-youth. A lot of the times, because what we see as youth projected in these future scenarios, oftentimes is going to be the idea of youth by people that are not youth.
Yes, like old people reverting back to being 20-year-old bodies, but having the mind of a 80 or 100-year-old person, exactly. And therefore ruling the world.
Exactly, because most of these utopias do not tolerate at all, youth expression, mm-hmm. subcultural expression, etc., etc. So, no matter how bad dystopias are, oftentimes they will include more people with disabilities. They will include more neurodivergent people. They will include more people of color. And so that's why I think, a lot of people from marginalized identities, when we were growing up, sort of cyberpunk was the only genre that we saw ourselves represented. Right. And so we grew up with that. Now, I was a massive fan of Ghost in the Shell. When I saw Ghost in the Shell, especially the second film, Innocence, and the world design of it, I was like, that's what I want to do. That is my dream. But little by little, sort of as I was, I guess, maturing in my intellectual, creative, whatever human scope, I started thinking, well, nature has been really, really important in my life. You know, disability, queer identity have been something that has really, really affected my understanding of the world. And relationship, not just with other humans, but with the planet, with other species. You know, that's been really, really a vital sort of node, again, in me becoming who I am. And yet, you know, cyberpunk doesn't include any of that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so that is problematic. I was just reading a beautiful book, Tamed and Untamed by Cy Montgomery. And there's a really beautiful passage that really speaks to these ideas of heaven and hell and dystopia, utopia. And she says that in Christian belief system, it's only humans that have souls, right? Animals do not have souls; they do not go to heaven. So when she imagines herself dying and going to heaven, and it's only people, and she says, "Well, surely that is hell. If it's only people and no other species, no other animal siblings of ours, that cannot be heaven." And so what I find really interesting is how that bias, right, very much sort of Judeo-Christian bias that puts human consciousness above any other consciousness, that says we have dominion, you know, over everything else, translated into the modern science, you know, which was not actually scientific. It was about proving this religious belief that we had, that we were superior, that we were the only ones that were special, and which you know, which made us think that that animal consciousness is not worthwhile of our understanding. We'd rather look up in the sky and imagine fictitious aliens than look into the soil and think of, you know, what are the minds of those other creatures. And obviously we studied them for very specific areas of neuroscience, but still from that completely superior perspective. And that really kind of goes back to the visions of the future, both in dystopia and in utopia. Most of the time, it always centers humans. And so when people say humanist design, human-centric design, I don't view that as a positive. You know, the only way for us to have a long-term future is to think of life-centric design. And so that goes back to why I started working on Protopia Futures, is really to challenge these assumptions of dualistic heaven and hell that always centered not just only humans, but only one particular type of default human that not that had to fit that very, very narrow sort of straight jacket of an identity. And Protopia is really about going beyond that, and looking into, you know, not singularity, looking into plurality, and really engaging with the living world.
Yeah, so let's break this down. You have this Protopia Futures framework, right? So it's I think in the article you say it's not a manifesto, it's a framework, which is an interesting distinction to make. But we have a graphic here that breaks it down into a set of principles. So can you explain roughly what this is all about so people understand it?
Sure. Yeah, so indeed, I mean, I think the difference between a manifesto and a framework, and especially how we saw it, is that it is not meant to be finite. You know, we put out the work that was written by me, but with major contributions, with about 30 people that are credited at the end of a text, with different quotes from them, with editing suggestions. So it's really very much a collaborative text, but it is meant not to stay static. So if anybody would notice that you completely overlooked this point, or this particular point was exclusionary, you know, we want to go back to that text and sort of readjust it and comment that, well, that's a particular area where we've grown. So we're not assuming that we have included everything, or that this is how it's going to have to be forever and ever. Protopia assumes that it's the best that we can imagine right now in solving the problems that we have based on our understanding. But as soon as we understand more, we will see other problems, we will see other inequities, and we will keep working on it. So, again, differently from utopia and dystopia, it's not an end destination. It's really about the process that requires an ever-expanding futures literacy and an ever deeper engagement with what future is and how all of us shape it with our action and our inaction. So, I've structured them around these 7 key points, but they overlap in many ways. So the first one is plurality. And it's a bit of a, really antithesis to singularity visions of the future. And here I'm really taking inspiration from Audrey Tang, who said, when we hear the singularity is near, let us remember plurality is here. And so it's really about seeing the world beyond the binaries, beyond the gender binary, beyond sort of racial binary, beyond age binary, beyond ability disability binary, and really seeing how so much space in between continues being underexplored. Which leads us to community, right? And the idea of community as really challenging Joseph Campbell's hero journey, that it's somehow this heroic individual that creates a change in the world. And that, yes, indeed, one individual can make things much, much worse, but one individual really struggles to make things significantly better. So it's about people coming together. And we actually have to come together, not because we're the same, but because we're different. Right? Because through the difference of our experience, through difference of our culture, through difference of our, lived knowledge, we'll be able to learn things from each other that we'd never be able to learn alone. Now, I think there's this very big misconception, and there's this notion that like, oh, well, you're not diverse enough if, you don't include the neo-Nazis among you. And I'm like, nope. That doesn't have to be that way. So if you can bring together groups that are really, really diverse without including people whose views will fundamentally undermine somebody else's, who happens always without exception to be from marginalized background, very humanity. Right. And so I'm not pro that kind of diversity. If you are bringing in a room a person that is deeply, deeply transphobic, you're going to make that space completely unsafe for a person who is trans, especially if it's a person of color, especially maybe if it's a person, trans person of color with disabilities, or queer trans person of color, et cetera, right? So you have to think, how can we create this diversity at the same time draw a line at bigotry?
Yeah, I think this is a conversation I keep returning to all the time with a lot of people, because that distinction you made, which is like, if you want diversity, you have to accept absolutely everything, otherwise it's not diversity. I think the line, if you think about it logically, the line is drawn where including someone whose premise is to exclude other people, like whose like their views are predicated on excluding another group, then you are, by including them, creating a non-diverse environment, right? Because and there's something about this Karl Popper thing with like, if you accept every view, then you end up marginalizing everyone because one view will always overpower everything else, is a very important insight. And it's a difficult one, but you can see that the people who think carefully about this always land on this conclusion, whereas those who want to make it very simplistic and very dualistic always end in the, no, we have to include everyone, including the most oppressive voices. And it's not a forward-thinking way of approaching the problem. So I agree completely.
Yeah, 100%. You have to think that in any given situation, with any given crisis, it's the person who has been historically the most marginalized that will suffer the most. And it's not just about them becoming silenced. It's about potentially a real danger to that person's life.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so that is just a non-negotiable. So, I think it's very, very important to understand. And that goes right with all the crises that are happening today, with COVID pandemic, with climate crisis. Who are the people at the front lines? Who are people that are experiencing the harm first? They aren't people that live in a global north.
Mm-hmm.
Or certain groups that are like most marginalized groups within the global north, right? But it tends to be the most marginalized groups within the global south, and then generally women among them, generally indigenous people among them, generally more than anything disabled and queer people among them, right? So there's always that kind of thing. It's like, well, but the oppressor can also become, the oppressed can become the oppressed. And I'm like, well, I don't know, show me a historical instance where people with disabilities have oppressed able-bodied people.
Yeah.
Like, we're not talking about different, just sort of specific ethnic groups or different nations. Yes, in cases where sort of your very identity is not pushing you to be at the bottom of the power pyramid, and you just you're just sort of privileged because of a very sort of short, specific historical circumstance or a very localized circumstance, then it's different, right? Then, of course, the oppressor can become the oppressed, et cetera, et cetera. Those things can move around, but not when your very identity is pushing you to the bottom, right? And it's making your life so much more difficult. So, I mean, these are a lot of false equivalencies and distractions. So, again, I believe that you can't, I don't think of things such as, hashtags futures for all. There is no such thing as futures for all. And I think there's some really, really amazing people working around these ideas of abolition and dealing with crime, with hate crime, with hate speech, etc. That's not my personal field of expertise. But in the future visions that I work towards, I know that somewhere you have to draw the line. And whenever you have to make a choice, you have to privilege the experience of somebody that has already experienced most harm because of how our society is structured. Another huge thing here to understand is that, it's also a massive privilege to not be born into bigoted perception of the world.
Yeah.
And that it doesn't come, it doesn't come automatically. Like ableism is, it's in the foundations of our language. Racism, anti-Blackness, anti-indigenism is encoded in the language itself. Especially within the Western languages, right? Misogyny is encoded in the language. Homophobia is encoded in the language. In our, in our media, in everything, right? So it's the air that we breathe. So it takes an active work, even for somebody who's queer, it takes an active work to unlearn how the world has marginalized you in its depictions. Be it narrative, be it visual, be it scientific, et cetera, right? So let's go back to the community conversation. Can you pull up that slide again? Yeah. Right? So again, my point is that it's not about singular individual hero, but it's really about people coming together to learn from each other while still not dehumanizing each other. I think that's the key, which leads us to the point of celebration of physical presence. What's been really, really striking me in so many of these techno-utopian visions of the world, and especially something that I've been reading quite a lot right now and conversed a little bit with the author Phil Torres on his critique of long-termism, which is a very it's an ideology of increasing popularity promoted by people like Nick Bostrom, which is that humanity has to fulfill its potential, and that potential is ultimately to transcend our bodies, upload ourselves to a computer matrix, and colonize the universe. Right? I think if we start with the idea that we have to colonize the world, that's already a problem, right? That you really haven't learned history. And then, where it connects to this point of celebration of physical presence and celebration of presence. I don't mean to imply ableist things of within this idea of physicality, right? There's many modalities of physical presence. But what I'm trying to say is that, again, it's a very Judeo-Christian thing. Body is evil. We have to transcend it. All of this other life on earth, it's not worth anything. We can't learn anything from animals. We need to become zeros and ones. And that is heaven, right? For me, it's a deeply diluted idea, and it's an idea that comes from disconnection from the living world and disconnection from each other, from other human beings, and from our very own selves. And I think that's what's so important. In most science fiction films, you see the sort of very, very isolated existence, the sort of singular hero somewhere on a rooftop looking over the city and being lonely, right? And my goal is to really try and depict relationships, people being together, future of love, future of sensual experience, future of just being in your body, future of dancing, future of swimming, future, of feeling the soil under your feet, and how our sensory experience of the world could be expanding. And for me, that's really sort of at the core of Protopia, right? Is to not look into the abstraction of zeros and ones, but to look into the physicality of the soil, of the water, of other living beings, and of our very own bodies.
Yeah, and that's something that has become very obvious during the pandemic. Is, on the one hand, it's become clear that doing what we're doing now, like this, we're talking to each other, but we're on screens and we're not physically in the same space, is different from being in a physical space with other people. And it doesn't matter how high quality our video cameras and our audio is, it's not the same. And the other thing is that this idea of not being able to go outside and being in the world, with the people that live in cities that were not able to leave their house for like a month or 2 or 3 months, has a tremendous impact on our physical bodies, not in terms of exercise, but in terms of the mental health that then affects the body. So this notion that you can be like this singular entity that lives on the internet, there's something fundamentally wrong about it. And we even experience it now that it doesn't work. Yet that somehow, like you said, is still the ultimate goal, like this singularity upload of humanity into like a AI mind. It's just crazy.
And it's very scientifically misguided. It's based on 90s, 80s science. Everything at the bleeding edge of both neuroscience and medical sciences and biological sciences is pointing to the fact that indigenous people actually have known for millennia that we are not zeros and ones and calculations that could be reduced to zeros and ones that are happening within the gray matter within our skull. Brain is not just within the skull. Brain is distributed throughout the body. And consciousness needs these complex interactions within our body to arise, right? So microbiome is now called the second brain. So the importance of all these microorganisms, it is us. And that represents over 90% of DNA within our body that is not ours, that are all these other microscopic living creatures. Within our gut, on our skin, in our hair, that's all us. That's all our own ecology, right? So we're not this sort of, isolated island within a vacuum. We, in fact, are these like, there's all these like little tendrils. When I come and take your hand and touch you, and even if I hug you, even more so, we exchanging our microorganisms. Right. But also, all these other complex interactions in our body, the hormonal cycles, whatever broken bone you have had within your body, whatever recurrent pain, that shapes your thoughts, that shapes who you become. And again, it's a very ableist idea to think that just makes you worse. You know, I know that I've experienced a lot of pain in my life. And as much as I don't want to experience that pain again, which inevitably I will, but it was instrumental in me becoming who I am and learning how I learned. You know, I would not be the same person have I not had that physical experience. And so again, you know, and for all of these little living creatures within us and on top of us, that are absolutely necessary for us to be healthy, we need the world, right? We need to interact not just with other humans, we need to interact with other species. We need to walk on the grass. We need to go and swim in a lake. We need to be in the contact with the living world. I mean, there's been studies and studies coming out how you know, patients after the surgery, you know, would recover much better if they had even just the view of the forest. That was giving a calming effect. And partially, I think it was giving a calming effect of because of the placebo effect, because our body remembers that when we actually walked in a forest and we could inhale all of its scents and we could feel of its textures, it actually had a healing capacity upon us. And that's not some kind of, you know, pseudo spiritual whatever thing, which unfortunately, especially with COVID pandemic, abounds. That's actually becoming a solid science. And now, of course, if you say that to any indigenous person, they're just going to laugh at you. Like, yeah, of course, no brainer. We've known that.
Yeah, it's like
right?
the
So
walkabout isn't a thing that some people do because they're weird. It actually makes sense to go like, you need to find yourself. You go out in nature and just be in nature, and you are there. You reappear to yourself.
yeah, I mean, and that's I think that leads us to the next point. Open up. Regenerative action, right? So initially I had that point called environmental awareness, which was really, I think, if you're really aware of the living world, inevitably your behavior will change, right? You will want to break that abusive, exploitative capitalist engagement cycle with other life here on this planet. But, you know, I've changed it to regenerative action. Well, first of all, to accentuate that sustainability is not enough. You know, so much damage has been done. We actually need to regenerate. Just stopping emissions, just stopping utilizing mineral-based materials, fossil fuels is not going to be enough. We actually need to rewild. We need to collect all of the poisons that we have released onto this world, and that's obviously an immensely difficult task, much bigger than just capturing carbon. But it also relates to indigenous perspectives on so-called sort of environmental studies, because as language matters, what the word environment implies is that something is around us, right? So what it says is that we are in a center, and the living world is just a background to this fantastical human endeavor, right? So in a way, it's just a setting for us, but it is not, right? And I think it's very important, and we're still trying to find better words for it. And I think we have to recognize, again, how these things are encoded in our language. So whenever I can, I try to move away from using the word environment and really talk about living world, you know, and other living beings, rather than sort of bringing it back to this notion that, you know, the planet is a resource that we are here to consume. So that's at the core of Protopian future thinking, from which comes also symbiotic spirituality. You know, so I'm not saying that, you know, religion has to become obsolete, but I think religion that otherizes us from each other and from other life, you know, that's something that we will definitely need to contend with. Because as long as we think that we are better just because, you know, we believe in this one thing rather than this other thing, and that by default is making us more worthy, I think that is quite problematic. At the same time, I think the need for ritual, the need for spirituality is encoded in for sublime, right? For transcendence is encoded in us as human beings. And so we need to think, well, what is that spirituality? What is that spirituality that really is about togetherness? Togetherness with each other and togetherness with the world. What does that look like? What are its rituals? How it's expressed? What is its art? I don't have the answers to yet, but that's what we're trying to imagine with the Protopia futures, which lead us to creativity. And creativity is really a key point in there. And I think that's what, genres such as sort of utopian solar punk does not really make enough space for. And that's not just the expression of the youth, though I feel that the youth's creativity and sort of youth subcultures have been most excluded from future visions. So to really think also of creativity, not just as, art as we know today, conventionally sort of artistic disciplines and artistic expressions, but really creativity in the most expansive sense of the word, right? I think future of education is creative education, because every student is different. We all move into the knowledge differently. And so somebody who's a teacher naturally is a creative person, even nursing, right? You have to be creative in how you help other people. Science, I mean, when you're inventing new theories, when you're inventing new possibilities, it is creative. And then even when we talk about arts, I'm really interested to imagine the future of art that is especially sort of based in a biological realm, right? So how instead of using more, it's interesting to see how we can use waste and to create art out of that. I think that's really wonderful way to recycle. But I'm also really interested in biological forms of art. What if instead of utilizing more plastic and more toxic materials, etc., to create something pretty, could we be creating, could the future graffiti be made out of lichen, right? Or out of wines, or out of, any sort of biological material that then kind of returns to the world? Like, could that be the future of creativity? And I think there's so many areas to explore in how creativity can be the answer to a whole lot of problems that we have today, including the problem of growth that our economy requires. There's no future of infinite material growth, but we could imagine infinite creative growth. We could imagine infinite growth of knowledge. And if we start valuing that, we can keep growing in these areas, because it's not about consuming more and more stuff and creating more and more waste. It's really about imagination and invention and understanding. So I think that's super, super interesting, which then leads us to the last point, evolution of cultural values, which I guess sums all of these things up. It's really, what do we value when we stop valuing ideas of power as power to oppress and exploit, and rather power as responsibility, as ability to do something that is about contribution rather than exploitation. And when we start admiring not sort of physical attributes and physical possessions, but things that are much more about how we are making each other feel, right? What are we bringing into this world? Like how that can become more valuable than superficial signifiers of wealth. And now, of course, that implies a baseline ability for everybody in this world to be able to have shelter and to nourish themselves, and to have these basic needs catered to. But what we would admire is not the people that accumulated billions and billions and billions of dollars, but people that actually shift the direction of our culture, of our policy, of our technology, of our science, that is less about accumulations of stuff and more about solving the problems that we know will affect all of us, but especially the most marginalized among us. So that was a long story about what Protopia is.
This is like way too short. This is what you have here is like a term of education for designers. You could easily build this into, say, we're going to do 6 months of this. Just take a month for each point and really dive into it. There's a question that's popped up here that was also on my mind, which is about next steps, right? We've identified the fundamental issues and built a framework to address these issues. What is the next line of action? Because, like I said in the beginning, when I read this the first time, I was like, this isn't just about, futurism and visions of science fiction and all the stuff. This is actually about today. This is about right now. This is about the design work we do in every single thing we do. So what is the next step? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, well, so again, the point of Protopia is that it should not stay, with myself or with our, because Protopia features not just myself, it's all of our collaborators and everybody that works on the projects with us. But it's not meant to stay with us. It's meant to also inspire other organizations, other researchers, scientists, technologists, policymakers. And so, my dream is to start seeing that popping up. My dream is to start seeing Protopian movies and TV series and games and university courses and, futures literacy programs for, kids in high school, right? So many things can be done around that. And as much as I can, I want to foster and support these projects, as well as generate some of these projects. But I think it's really about bringing together people that are experts each in their field, right? At the same time, coming together so we can all have a broader context of what future is made of. Right? Because the sort of deep siloing is a very, very big problem, right? And so you have brilliant scientists that are working towards something, but without having time to really think, well, what could be all of the potential consequences? Without having time to consider how would that affect disabled people of color, right? Without having the time to think how it could establish neocolonial relationships between sort of the minority and majority worlds. So, it was funny. I had this really funny interaction on LinkedIn the other day that felt like, Twitter trolling situation. Somebody just, I posted this thing saying about for the future of sustainability, we have to think about global demilitarization. Sorry, English second language. And it's end of the day here, so that we absolutely have to think about that, because there's no sustainability if our global geopolitics is still predominantly dominated by military interaction. Mm-hmm. And if we actually maintain these massive fleets of aircraft and drone craft and arsenal of all these weapons of lethal destruction. And even when we talk about the future of warfare is information warfare and surveillance and stuff like that, even those data centers, they require way too much energy to run. Right. Yeah. And then that person came in and started saying, but there's a lot of brilliant people in the military that are trying to find these solutions, they're trying to decarbonize the warfare. And I'm like, my question was not if there are brilliant people. Surely there are. But that is, again, the problem. It's a problem that some of the most brilliant minds of the 90s and early 2000s were working ultimately on selling digital ads.
Yeah.
Right? Social media was about advertising, right? And that's a problem that so much brilliant talent went in and stayed in those areas, right? So, but, am I the best expert on the future of the militarization? Of course not. But I think we as people in different areas of future conversations, but future conversations, again, are not just about technology. It is also about future of policy. It's about future of grassroots activism. It's about future of racial inclusion, etc., etc., etc. Right?
Mhm.
And all of that is future thinking. I mean, I think of Adrienne Maria Brown and Walida Mauritius quote that all organizing is science fiction. And for me, organizing and imagining a better and more inclusive, better is a bit of a moral judgment, but like a more inclusive world, that is more science fiction than imagining these virtual humans that are in fact computer simulations colonizing Alpha Centauri.
Mhm.
And now that's my personal take, but that is what my take is. And so within that take, I consider that global demilitarization is absolutely necessary, because that cannot be the way we think of geopolitics, the way we think of relationships between different nation states, because the problems that we're facing, be it the pandemic or biosphere collapse, or refugee crisis that is related to all of these aforementioned things, these are the problems that will require collaboration, not competition. And I know that seemed like a fundamentally difficult step, but that's why we have to come together across disciplines and imagine what it takes.
Yeah, I think this is the perfect place to stop, because this is exactly what you just said encapsulates everything. And I think everyone who watches this, everyone who joined us for the chat, there's a lot of activity going on in the chat. Everyone who will watch this afterwards will see why I'm saying that this is really such an important idea for design in general and just for humanity. So I thank you so much for joining me on this and sharing your vision and sharing your ideas with us. And I think we'll end the broadcast here, just so that you get some time back to live your life.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I mean, I feel like I should have answered way more questions, but everybody who has questions, please tweet at me, Protopia Futures, Monika Bielskyte, and then let's keep conversing there.
I'll put all your links in the comments for this event, and you can also, this magic of the internet, you can actually go in and like answer the questions afterwards, because this persists.
That's cool.
So the conversation can continue post this event.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I'd be one of these people that is able to talk and look at the feed at the same time. Like when I think I can't see stuff, but I'm very envious of people that can do that. So I'm sorry if I didn't get the chance to answer more, but I would love to keep exchanging with y'all.
Yeah, there's a flood of thank you coming in. So,
all right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for coming. Thank you to everyone who watched and everyone who will be watching. And hopefully sometime in the future, we can come back and talk about this and revisit this conversation when things have evolved in some way.
That would be wonderful. We have, for anybody in Berlin, we have the first Protopia Futures IRL exhibition. So all this work that happened virtually over the pandemic, I'll be able to see for the first time people's reactions in the physical world to it. So that's really exciting. I don't even know how I'm going to feel about it, because it's been a long time without, like only seeing digital comments and not people's reaction in the real space. So looking forward to that.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, everyone. I will end the broadcast now.
Pleasure. Thank you. Bye.